Professor Kumet, I hope we can agree that I'll respond to these questions, and after that, you allow 5 more. I respond to those, and then we close. Can we agree to that? Agreed. No, let me say that there are a number of suggestions which have actually responded to what I asked, which was, what do you as thought leaders think we should do to address these challenges that were presented here and presented by our teachers here? A number of responses to that particular challenge, which are important, including the last comment that has just been made. Issue that's been raised, was raised earlier. One of us talked about Pretoria Township's Mamelodi and all that. Somebody else earlier would spoken about the need to inculcate in us this sense of African identity and an understanding of what that means. And even the young, and they said, let's develop enough literature so that people have got access to this material which teaches them this recognition of this African identity, the challenges it carries, and therefore our own responsibilities in that regard. Now, I agree entirely with this proposal that we need to look at ourselves. That's what I was saying. That in response to all of these things that are being said, what do we do about ourselves? What do we do about the rest of the world? Part of what we must do about ourselves is indeed what is indicated. How are we drawing our youth and our communities into an understanding of the kind of challenge that we face as a country and continent so that they engage in those processes of change? Now, I was hoping that you were going to answer that question rather than pose it. Sia, where are you? There is Sia. I got a colleague of mine here, Siabulela Keve, who works at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. And this is one of the issues that they discuss a lot at the foundation. Exactly this question. What is it that we should do here at home? And exactly to engage the youth in these sorts of processes that we're talking about. So before we disappear, you can catch him and tell him where to find you. Because I'm quite sure that he'd be very, very keen to engage this. All the challenges that were thrown up, how do we, to our colleague there in a green jacket, the questions that he posed were very important. Questions that were posed here in front and at the back there about the development of the younger generation into change agents in a very practical and localized way. That indeed would be important. I'm saying that's an important suggestion, and we need to find a way of following it up. Then there are other questions that are raised about, for instance, our colleague there, I don't know if he was asked, he was permitted to ask a question, having spoken about what he is teaching. The SDG, how can we expect the West to help Africa to develop? Now, what Africa needs, among other things, is a good educational system, properly financed. That is from preschool up to university. I'm saying properly financed, so that you have the requisite teachers, the requisite laboratories, the requisite whatever else. And Africa needs more factories so that we're able to process the things that we're digging out of the mines, so that indeed we cease to be this exporter of raw materials. Now, for that you need, for instance, smelters. Now, smelters are very expensive things to run from the point of view of energy. They require a lot of electricity. So when I'm saying that you need all of these factories and then all of those smelters, etc., you need also to have ensured that you've got a strong enough capacity to generate the energy that is required. You need roads and rail and that kind of infrastructure. If you look at, take a comparative study of what the South African ports charge in terms of movement of goods in and out of the South African ports, you would see that they are much, much more expensive than, for instance, you would take Singapore. That has an impact on your capacity to grow and develop the economy. What is it that we need to do to reduce the cost of movement of goods and in and out of South Africa? I'm saying there are many things of this kind that you need to do in order to develop the continent, so that we reduce unemployment, so that we reduce poverty, we reduce levels of underdevelopment. Now, our colleagues will see that the one was asking this question, how do we expect the West that it can help Africa to develop? That there are such parts of the Sustainable Development Goals which address this issue of the need for higher rates of growth, higher rates of development, not just growth, better shared wealth, less inequality, all of those things. Now, as you will have seen, the things I'm talking about, I'm saying better financed education, investment in new factories and infrastructure and so on. All of these things need investment. That means capital. Where is it going to come from? That's an objective reality. You can't build a factory without capital, without investment. A new factory means investment. A new university means investment. Now, if you take South Africa, you know very well that here in this country, we don't save enough to be able to generate the levels of investment that this economy needs. We don't. So, if we talk about reducing levels of unemployment, creating new jobs, and financing higher education, free higher education and all that, we must also answer the question, where's the money going to come from? You see, sometimes I have very good dreams. You know, when Prof. Vice Chancellor dream, you know, of a new city that is born in South Africa, which is brand new factories, huge employment of people, and everybody happy. The problem is that the dream does not build that new city. So when the question is raised, how come we expect the West to help Africa to develop? That's related to the question, where else is the capital going to come from to develop us? We don't have it. It's not enough. And I think there was even an addition of China to this equation. So rather than pose the question to me, we should answer this question. Where do we generate the capital to ensure that we are able to develop? Now, it's relevant to the matter that was mentioned earlier. I think that the very first person to speak, who fortunately made suggestions rather than pose questions. And one of the things which is said is that one of the things we need to do is to address a particular relationship with regard to finances between, I think it said, 14 Francophone African countries and France. And he's right. He's right because you've got a whole number of African countries which bank their foreign reserves in Paris. And in order to access money which is their money, they borrow it and are charged interest rates. So that is, those are resources, capital resources, investment money, which exactly we need on our continent in order to be able to develop the continent. But we ourselves are exporting it to France and only access it by way of loans. That's one answer to the question. What do we do to generate the capital that we need? That's one answer, but it's an important part of an answer to that question. You will know we also did a report on the matter about illicit financial flows of huge volumes of capital which leave the continent illicitly. And in that report, we gave a figure of $50 billion a year. The later estimates actually put it at 80 billion. Of resources that leave the continent where they should have remained and would have had a major impact in terms of supplying us with the capital that we need. I'm saying that's another question. That another intervention which would help us to address the matter, where do we get this capital? Somebody mentioned here in passing in the Marshall Plan, which was money the Americans made available at the end of the Second World War to develop these countries of Western Europe. The Americans had similar relations with Japan at the end of the war. They had similar relations with South Korea at the end of the war. You had certain relations, and for instance, with Taiwan. You had certain relations later between Japan and the Southeast Asian nations, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. I'm sure you'd have seen the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was in Washington recently. And one of the things she said publicly was to thank the United States for what it did in terms of the Marshall Plan to help to redevelop Germany. So I'm mentioning this because I think there's something that we should not accept, at least I don't, which is the notion that it is wrong to expect the flow of capital flows from the richer to the poor, that this thing is wrong. It's a wrong thesis. If you look at the development of West Europe at the end of the World War, there were huge capital flows from America to Europe, as with Japan. as with South Korea, as with Taiwan. Of course, what drove that, those major capital flows from the rich to the poor, was what was called the containment of communism. To rescue, to make sure that the West European countries don't fall under the influence of the Soviet Union, make sure you develop them. Korea, same. Japan, same. Taiwan, same. And Southeast Asia, next, same. It was a political decision. But they understood that development depended on the movement of large volumes of capital from the rich to the poor. The same thing is required on this continent, of Africa. Africa is not going to develop by cutting itself off from the rest of the world. It can't. We produce gold. We can't eat it. We got to sell it to somebody else who needs it. An international relationship is unavoidable for us as a continent. So the question is, how do we answer that question? What is it that we need to do in order to intervene in a manner which succeeds in drawing these large volumes of capital that we need? And so the point that was raised, I thought by the last person there, that part of what we need to do is to respect ourselves. To take decisions, to define for ourselves what kind of future do we want, and to respect those decisions. Because we can't disrespect ourselves and expect the rest of the world to respect us. And this is very correct. So that's part of the response we must have. I must not be too long about this. You know, when we worked on NEPAD, we then said to the developed countries, the G8 that was mentioned earlier, we said to them, look, this is Africa's conception of how Africa must develop. Now, we want you people to redesign your system of cooperation with the rest of the continent to be consistent with this African vision of Africa. So they agreed and drafted what was called the G8 Africa Action Plan. So they looked at our plan and they said the Africans want to do this, they want to do this, want to do the other. Okay, how do we come into this? Hence this G8 Africa Action Plan. That was in 2002 when they adopted the G8 Africa Action Plan. 10 years later, by 2012, it had died. It had ceased to exist. Nobody abolished it. But gradually it ceased to exist. And the reason it ceased to exist was because these Western countries could see that they had committed themselves to certain issues here, which were going to weaken their position with regard to the African continent and strengthen the continent. And therefore, it withered away, the G8 Africa Action Plan. In good measure, because of our weakness as Africans, that we didn't stand up to defend this. So this matter was agreed, and there's a mutually responsible system of accounting. You can't walk away. But we allowed it to wither away. This is to exist. But that's our weakness. And I'm saying those are some of the things that we must address in terms of addressing this. Now, very quickly, these other things. Somebody raised a matter about Washington consensus. I wanted to ask the question. You know, it was him. There he is. What was the national consensus? He says there was something called the national consensus which trapped us here as a result of which certain things didn't happen according to Naomi Klein, according to Sam Peter Blanche and all that. What was the national consensus? What did it say? I'd expected him. No, I'm not going to ask you to do that. You see, it would be important to explain that. To say this is what the national consensus said, and this is what happened in our country consistent with that consensus, and therefore this outcome. It would be important to do that. And I'm quite certain that you actually can't substantiate that argument. It's not possible. Because if you look at what the Washington consensus said, and looked at what practically happened in South Africa, you will see that it doesn't matter what Naomi Klein and Sampi say. This didn't happen. There was no implementation of a Washington consensus here. And I'm going to ask my colleagues here to take your email address so we can send you some material in detail on this issue. You see, because, I mean, that's part of what being a thought leader is, to think. Not to say simply because Professor Sam Peter Blanche said this, therefore it must be true. I think the point was made. To develop this critical faculty. To say, let me look at this thing. What does it mean? It would be important to do, but we can send you the material on this and you'll see. We looked at it in detail. What does it say? Washington Consensus says about international trade. What does it say about the role of the state? What does it say about nationalization? You know, all of these things. And we said, well, what happened in this country with regard to all of these things? And so you got a more or less objective analysis of the actuality. So as I say that, give us your details, we'll send you the material. The African, yes indeed, there is a decision to establish an African criminal court. The protocol for the court has been approved, has been agreed. It's in the process of being ratified by our parliaments. It requires ratification by a certain number of parliaments for it to come into force. But the decision was taken a long time ago to establish this African Criminal Court, which is the same mandate as the International Criminal Court. So as soon as the African parliaments have approved this protocol, it will then be appointed. Now, one of our colleagues was saying that he has grave doubts about even the wisdom of that, because he doesn't trust the African judges. Now, I wouldn't say that, because again, you see this is an image, a general picture. But if I said, okay, let's then go through these African judges country by country and say to you, what's wrong with the judiciary of Lesotho? You'd probably say, I don't know. And I'd say, what's wrong with the judiciary of Botswana? You'd say, I don't know. And the South African one, no, I respect these ones, I've seen they're okay. So I'm saying we can go through these African countries to ask this question. What is it that informs a general view that the African judiciary is bad? What are the details, what are the facts of that which inform that judgment? And you'll probably find that it's what you read in the newspapers. And because it appeared there, you take it as gospel truth. So that's why I'm saying that I wouldn't myself take a negative view about the African judiciary, to make a general statement. I might want to make statements about the judiciary in particular countries based on how they have performed. But I'm saying that the African Criminal Court will be established as soon as this protocol has been approved by the parliaments. Indeed, so that, as was agreed on the continent a long time ago, these cases about human rights violations, about war crimes and so on, we can deal with them on the continent. So that even the International Criminal Court remains what it's supposed to be in terms of the Rome Statute, the statute which established the court. Because the statute says the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. In the circumstances where countries are either unable or unwilling to address the particular matters. If we are unable or unwilling, then it comes to court. If the African continent has this African Criminal Court, and therefore has the ability to try cases of this kind, the International Criminal Court itself would say, no, but if you want to bring a case to us, there's a court in Africa. That's the court of first resort. If it fails, then sure, you can come to us. So I'm saying that that is in the process of establishment. The last thing is, maybe let me just say something about this neoliberalism. You see, the thing I was saying with regard to the Washington consensus is exactly this thing about neoliberalism. And part of what has been of concern to me is the misuse of scientific categories to be as insults. To say a thing is neoliberal, there was a liberal construct. A liberal construct in economics, it would be represented by Adam Smith. That kind of notion of capitalism. It's a liberal concept. Change later to this neoliberal. Therefore, the word neoliberal in this context is not a swear word. It's a scientific category. To say rather than the framework proposed by Adam Smith as a liberal capitalist economy, you've got this later model, which is a neoliberal capitalist economy. Now it needs then to be specified, to say what is it that constitutes that neoliberalism, so that even if you decide I'm going to fight it, you know what kind of animal you are fighting. If you just use it as a swear word, it's not taking us anywhere. So I think that in the context of our being thought leaders, that's one of the things we must examine. I know that this particular word or description is used quite frequently here at home. This is neoliberalism. It's like this white monopoly capital. What does that mean? What does that mean? You know, and you have references to, in terms of the white monopoly capital thing, to the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts. Sure, these are big capitalists, no doubt. But in a scientific way, when you say we must deal with the challenge of white monopoly capital, you've got to understand it not as an insult, but as a specific socio-economic formation. So that you are then able to say, if this is a problem, this is how we should deal with it. And South African capital, domestic capital, is not the same now as it was in 1990. Radical changes. Part of them have got to do with the fact that with the end of the apartheid system, the end of sanctions, a lot of your domestic capital expanded. It has a footprint globally. So what used to be volumes of capital which were captured within South African borders changed. It doesn't mean your capitalists have become smaller, they haven't. But their investments are spread out all over the globe. A monopoly position that existed in 1990 doesn't necessarily exist in 2017. It's because of the nature of the behavior of capital. If you understand the behavior of capital globally, you would understand that. So I'm saying even things like that. It's necessary really to have a scientific understanding of these things. Not just simply because Thabo Mbeki said white monopoly capital, therefore it's correct. The last thing about the admission of Morocco. Yes, indeed, Morocco reapplied to rejoin, not to rejoin, to join for the first time the African Union. And the argument that was presented during the summit, this last summit in January, was that it would be better to have Morocco inside the African Union in order to engage Morocco on the matter of Western Sahara. It would be better to have Morocco inside rather than outside, to help solve the problem of Western Sahara quicker. That was the argument. And indeed, many of the heads of state, they were saying, the very fact that this matter about Western Sahara is being handled by the UN with a very little input from the African continent is precisely because Morocco is not a member. So we as Africans, to solve our own problems, we must engage Morocco. So that's the argument that was used, and indeed Morocco was admitted. Now, before we came here, it was this afternoon, I was reading the latest resolution of the African Union Peace and Security Council on the matter of Western Sahara. I'm sure Professor Gumede can circulate that thing among yourselves. It's a very, very interesting resolution because it confirms the positions that the African Union, the OAU before the African Union, and the African Union have taken on the issue of Western Sahara. That the people of Western Sahara must have the right to hold a referendum to define their status. That therefore the Security Council of the UN must do this, the AU must do the other, and so on, to respect this decision. Now this decision was taken yesterday by the African Union Peace and Security Council, which says, therefore the African Union has not said, as was suggested by somebody, has not said, let Morocco come back in order that we can forget about the problem of Western Sahara. Yesterday, the African Union takes a decision that we're not changing our position and we're insisting on the implementation of decisions that were taken by the OAU and the AU. And indeed, the same resolution regrets that the representatives of Morocco who were asked to participate in the meeting to discuss the thing actually boycotted the meeting. But I'm saying the important thing about it is that, contrary to what has been suggested, the African Union has not abandoned its positions on Western Sahara. And I should like to say the second point with regard to that is that Morocco itself could not insist that we will only come into the African Union if the African Union de-recognizes Western Sahara. So you have Western Sahara as a member, full member of the AU. You have Morocco as a full member. And they work like that. So it may very well be that what was suggested, that it would be better to have Morocco inside to speed up the matter of the resolution of the conflict in Western Sahara. It may very well be that might be proved to be correct. But as of now, the position that the AU has taken is that it must respect the earlier decisions which recognize the independence of Western Sahara. Which I think that's all. Thanks.